Christianity was one of the big religions that I was excited to explore in this documentary because of how large and synonymous it is when it comes to prayer. And any prayer that I have done in my life has, I dare to say, been an attempt to replicate their way of prayer. So it will be interesting to see how much I got right and how much I didn't.
I'm Father Daniel. I'm the priest in charge of Cardiff Cathedral in Charles Street in Cardiff.
My name is Elliot. I'm a student for the priesthood for the Archdiocese of Cardiff.
Prayer is like the sort of the foundation, really, upon which everything else that we do as a person of faith is built up. You know, because people can see faith and a Christian, for example, as we are, as being something which is like following rules. You know, and Catholics are great at rules, and we can be great at Catholic guilt, aren't we? And for rules and regulations, do this, do that. You certainly can't do that. Absolutely no, and so it becomes very two-dimensional. But faith is more than just those sets of rules and regulations. At the heart of prayer is a relationship. Is the building up of a relationship with God. That's really the fundamental part. It's not just about the rules and regulations; those sort of flow from it. Because our relationship with God means that we want to behave and we want to be a particular way. They're not the start point, really.
Prayer is absolutely essential. They talk about prayer being the breathing of the soul. You take in that oxygen and you give out those concerns to God. I think relationship is very much at the at the heart of what prayer is. As Christians, we believe in a loving God. We believe in a God who wants to be with us and wants to have that relationship with us. And so we experience that through prayer, through that time spent with the Lord, trying to listen to his voice, but also telling him how we feel. It's that two-way traffic, if you will, which is that relational bit. If you imagine your significant other, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, when you want to spend time with them, you want to get to know them. Sometimes it's easier to listen to them than others. Sometimes you can see where they're going, sometimes you can't. And it's exactly the same with our relationship with God, and that's our experience of prayer. Sometimes the prayer is good, sometimes we can see what's happening, where God is working. Other times, it's like bashing your head against a brick wall. But you persevere because we
can never imagine in our heads what we think prayer is, and you watch a program, a soap, and you've got the sort of all the candles lit and the sort of the formulaic part of prayer, the reciting of stuff. But that two-way dimension that Elliot was saying is quite important, because part of it is not saying anything, is the listening, and God speaks into that silence. So we sort of bombard God with prayers, with stuff, with things we want, but that silence becomes an essential component in the response. And what we expect from that response might be akin to, I don't know if you're too young to remember, the National Lottery finger used to come, and it could be you. You expect sort of God to sort of pop out like sort of the fairy godmother and sort of wave the magic wand for 3 wishes. But God doesn't answer our prayers in those sort of obvious ways. It does for some people, but normally it's in the quiet movements which begin to move and mould us. And it's often only through retrospect, through looking back, that you can begin to see the sort of the finger of God working in your life, in that decision that you made, in not doing that, begin to see the action of God, and how that quiet working becomes something which is quite transformative in your life. And then the more you experience that and reflect and have that quiet time, that silent time, is the more you want it, and then that's how the relationship builds. And so those awkward silences become less awkward, because when you're couched up on the sofa with somebody you love, the most profoundly intimate moments are when you don't say anything at all to each other, isn't it? It's not about talking. You don't talk to your significant other all the time. And as single people, you can see when two people go out for a meal who clearly love each other, because they will ignore each other for the whole of the evening and not speak to each other, and then at the end they'll say, well, we've had a fantastic evening, because it's that being with the person. And it's the same in prayer, it's that being with, and prayer is more than just a mind exercise. Prayer isn't just the sort of the things we think, but certainly for Christianity, prayer is a holistic experience. It looks at body, mind, spirit. So I don't know if you've ever been to a Catholic service, you certainly build up your steps, because you're standing, sitting, kneeling, you do stuff, you respond, there's smell involved with incense and stuff, there's things that you see, the beautiful things around you. All of those things aid our holistic experience of prayer, raising our hearts and our minds to God, to something more than ourselves, to focus us outwards to ourselves.
It's quite important, actually, when we think from a Christian understanding, we believe that we are made for God. C.S. Lewis puts it wonderfully. He talks about the God-shaped hole, so that in everybody there's that yearning for God, that hole that nothing else can fill. And there's that big kind of temptation nowadays to try and fill it with sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever, ambition. And ultimately those things just leave us yearning for more. St. Augustine talks about our souls are restless until they rest in God. And so prayer is an essential part of that. Finding ourselves in God, finding that peace that only He can give us. And we build up that relationship through spending time, through engaging Him. Catholics traditionally aren't very good at the Bible. We're well known for not knowing where we're going in the Bible, but it's something that's really quite important, especially at the moment when we're celebrating a year of the Word, a year of the Scriptures, where we are asked to go deeper into the Scriptures. And that is such a profound way that our Lord talks to us. So through our prayer, through spending time meditating on the Scriptures, St. Ignatius, one of the big proponents of prayer in the Church, he talks about using the Scriptures, using the stories in the Scriptures, and putting yourself in the scene. So all the famous moments in the Scriptures, the crucifixion, putting yourself at the foot of the cross, the joy of the resurrection, putting yourself with the women who first see the Lord risen from the dead, and kind of engaging with prayer on that way, kind of experiencing the Lord in the mysteries of His life, and how that then penetrates into our own lives. Because prayer is, again, this reciprocity, this giving. We give ourselves to God, we make ourselves vulnerable before God, and God comes into that vulnerability, and He brings with it His healing, His grace, His strength for us. Sometimes, and quite often, in ways that we don't recognise at the time. It's always easier to recognise God in hindsight than in the moment, and that's always a source of great strength, and that's a fundamental aspect of prayer. That's the joy of prayer, is there are many different ways. There are as many different ways of praying as there are people, and that's it's always wonderful when you ask somebody else, how do you pray? And they say, well, I do this. And you think, I had never thought of prayer like that. Or somebody else does it that way. And there's just this great richness of the tradition of prayer that you can kind of dip into and work out what works for you.
sometimes we mistake prayer for being that formal time in the day where we get on our knees, join our hands, and we have that type of formal experience, or we have to be in church, or we have to be in front of a religious image and things. You know, that's a very restrictive idea of what prayer is. You know, if we understand, as we were saying, prayer to be that intimacy, like with between lovers, you know, you sort of speak all the time, and in the silence then becomes not an absence of sound, but actually something more than that, because you love that person. It's a full silence, if you know what I mean. And so with prayer, it's not necessarily those formal moments. You know, for Christians, there are those formal moments which form the pillars of our faith. So the Sunday celebration of Mass, for example, is one of them. You know, the morning offering that you make. You know, those things which you do in the day are those formal moments where we formally turn to God in a particular way. Mass is very interesting. That formal living out of prayer is, you know, where Christians, Catholics, get their strength from. It's like the place where you get nourished through the Word, through Scripture, and through the Eucharist, to be able to live out your life in the world. But there are other ways to pray as well. You know, Trees of Avila, isn't it? It talks about praying through the pots and the pans. You know, the ordinary things that you do. They become something which you do for the best of your abilities, because it's a gift to the Lord. You know, your gifts and your talents are themselves expressions of prayer, because it's the handing over of something vulnerable and precious of you to somebody else, and how that's reciprocated. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, there's people go up into the mountains. You know, the journey up the mountains, you know, for us lucky people who lived in the valleys, the mountains were always seen as being places people went to encounter the divine, to encounter God. So Moses went up the mountain to speak to God, to receive the Ten Commandments and all of that. So going up the mountain, and you know, you just go look at the beauty of like the Welsh countryside, but to go up the mountain can be for lots of people. You know, you go up Snowdonia, Brecon, Beacons, a place of encountering God, seeing the beauty of the world around you. You know, the intricacies of nature, how everything fits together. All of those are expressions of our faith and of that life of prayer, because it leads us outside of ourselves. It takes us to God, to something else, to someone else. I think at the heart.
I suppose there are two major aspects of how one comes close to God. The first one being silence, that Father has just spoken about. Again, that kind of image of us going up the mountain. So when we go into silence, we can go up that mountain to meet the Lord. Another image is to go deeper. So we go deeper into ourselves, and that's where we find the Lord within our deepest introspections, in our desires, in our fears. And we find the calming presence of God. We find the encouragement that God gives us. But it's also important to recognise that we can also discover God through what we do. I was raised with cheesy Christian music, and some of it is of dubious quality. But one of the lines in one of the songs was, "May my whole life be a song of praise." So may my whole life be a prayer. So again, looking at the great saints of the Church. In fact, we keep talking about Saint this and Saint that, because they give us examples of prayer. These are the people who have led a life in constant prayer in some way or another, and they give us an example of how we too can live that life of prayer. So if you think of people like St. Vincent de Paul, who took our Lord's commandment to serve him and to recognise him in the poor, he took that as the core of his being, and he found the Lord and he spoke of the Lord in his service to the poor and the most needy in society. The same with with St. Alphonsus Liguori. His motto, Copiosa apud Deum redemptio. With him there is plentiful redemption. And that was what he brought to the poor, what he brought to the marginalised. So we find God very much in other people, in our service, in our generosity. Again, it's like reciprocity, that idea of reciprocity. We give of ourselves, so God gives himself to us first, because God is always seeking us. God always makes the first move. Again, coming back to that metaphor of the lover looking for his beloved. God always makes the first move towards us. And then we make that move back towards him in our prayer, in our loves, in our charity, in how we experience other people and how we serve other people. So I think it's important to also recognise that we come close to God in how we live our lives and in how we serve our brothers and sisters. That prayer goes beyond just, again, those formal moments of prayer to encompass our whole lives. So prayer isn't just saying things with our lips or those moments in the day, but prayer is a lifestyle, as it were. Prayer is your whole life is a prayer, and it's that encompassing recognition of the presence of God and how I relate to him and how he relates to me.
It doesn't just stay in a little circle. There's no sort of there's can be no duality about life. You know, we're not separate things, spiritual beings, physical beings. You know, so there's, you know, it has to lead into a particular action. It has to lead into action, and then the more that you reflect, and part of that prayer is reflecting upon us in the place where we're at, where we find ourselves. You know, what's going on at a deeper level. And what you find is that things begin to pop to the surface. You know, those things, it could be a vice, several vices, but will pop to the surface. And then that becomes then the experience of grace, that God's saying, you know, we're not perfect. There are things in our lives which require that little bit of attention. It could be a trauma from the past which is unresolved. It could be anything. And then that's the Lord revealing that bit of light, saying, you know, you're ready now to deal with this, to look at this vice, this trauma, this hurt, to be able to seek then, and we experience then in the action, as a consequence of prayer, Jesus' healing hand. And that healing hand in our life, that healing that we need. And we all experience at different times. But the Lord never gives us more, reveals more than we're able to handle. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be easy, but it's making that journey. But all of that happens all in the context of prayer. So it's not necessarily, you know, sitting cross-legged or anything, or knelt down, and when you're not doing that, you're not praying. You know, it's a continual, that everything that we do, everything that we live and breathe becomes the prayer in itself. Which is why, as Christians, then that action means we want to become better people. We want to be, you know, we want to lose off those chains and those shackles of those things which hold us back, those things which don't bring us that ultimate fulfillment, like Eliot was saying, those things which, you know, where we search to try and fill that hole, and we all know what we mean, that sort of something inside us, which nothing else seems to fill, and that's the becomes the fruit of prayer then. The fruit of that time we spend with God.
Again, you talked about the Eucharist, so the celebration of Mass. The Church describes the Eucharist as the supreme prayer. So whenever we gather for liturgical prayer, so the celebration of Mass, services, kind of structured services in church, we come together as the whole body of Christ, the whole community, to pray. So there's that experience of communal prayer, that I'm not on my own in this. You know, there are other people who are having this experience of prayer, this experience of God, sometimes struggling with it, sometimes finding that easy, So I learn from the people around me. But then if we look at the Mass, we start with the readings, so we encounter our Lord in the Scriptures. So we draw close to him as he speaks with us in his word. Then we present our prayers to the Father in response. So the bidding prayers, the petitions that we read out formally in Mass. So these are the things that are on our heart. These are our concerns. These are the things where we cry out to the Lord and we say, Lord, help us. Then we begin to celebrate the liturgy of the Eucharist. So the Eucharist, where the bread and the wine is transformed into the body and blood of Christ through that supreme prayer of the Church, the Eucharistic prayer, where we give thanks to God for the great mysteries of faith, that he became man to die and take away our sins so that we might be raised up to be with him. So again, there's a beautiful movement of him coming down to take us up with him, and then we receive him in the most special way through the reception of Holy Communion, through the reception of his body and blood. And that is the most profound experience of God, the most profound prayer that we can have, because that's God himself is present in a little host. God himself is present in the wine which has become his blood. And to receive that is, and to have him unite himself with us. Fulton Sheen talks about it being in terms of the food chain. So when we eat something lower down, it becomes part of us. But when we eat the body and blood of Christ, we become part of him. We are united in a special way with him in that moment, and that's the supreme act of prayer, which then informs how we live our life, informs our other moments of prayer, in service, in formal prayer, in mental prayer, in whatever, but all flows out from that experience of our Lord in the Eucharist. And that's the very centre of the Church's prayer, and everything comes towards that and flows from it. And it's the Eucharist is very much the fountain of grace, which helps us to live our Christian life.
The important thing to remember is that we are more than the sum of our feelings. So the feelings could give us an indication, but lots of people experience different journeys in their life, especially in their life and their relationship with the Lord. As I say, it's not always a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's not like skipping through. It's not always like skipping through long grass with a sort of flowery shirt. It's a movement of the will. It's an action that we do, and many people go for long periods of time and they don't experience anything back. I'm sure you've heard there's a phrase called the dark night of the soul, and they experience that they sort of seem to be talking to the Lord, and the Lord just sort of doesn't seem to respond, and we can call it in the spiritual life, it's like a dry spell, you might not experience, but even in those moments, the persevering through those moments, knowing, and it's the faith that we have, it gives us that ability to persevere through, to know that there is something else at the end of it, that this is not a time wasted. So it's one of the famous people who experienced a dark night for many years was Mother Teresa. She experienced in her life, that's right, isn't it, that darkness. St. John of the Cross wrote a whole book about the dark night of the soul. That's entering in, and even something like, there's a very famous poem called Footprints, which speaks about walking along the beach with the Lord. And as you look back, as we talk about looking back, where we see the hand of God, the footsteps of God, we see the two sets of footprints in the sand, us and God's, and we're walking along, and then there's a moment where the person looks back and there's one set of footprints, and because they sort of kick off then, look God, all of these times there's one set of footprints, it's only during the times where I'm finding things the most difficult? You know, where are you during all of these times? And that's a very good question. But then what comes as the conclusion is the reassurance that actually during those times where we think we're by ourselves, God is actually there in the heart of it. He carries us with him. So even through those moments, but it is, you know, you talk about it being a relationship, being like that intimate, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily get the fuzzy feeling. It's, you know, some of the saints call it, you know, it's the Opus Dei, the work of God. It's a work that, you know, that we do, and it requires that persevering through.
Again, to use the metaphor of a relationship, as lovely as it would be for every moment in a relationship to be all sweetness and light, there are moments when you're angry with your partner. There are moments when you don't necessarily feel the love that's between you. There are moments obviously of joy as well, but in these moments when it's more difficult, we all have a choice to make. Do we stay or do we go? To quote the famous song. And that's that's exactly the same with the spiritual life as well. We have that choice. You know, do we stick with the Lord or do we go, or do we seek that fulfillment elsewhere? Ultimately, with the Lord, there is that fulfillment, even when we can't see him. Again, to draw on the poetry of John of the Cross, St. John of the Cross talks about seeing little glimpses of the Lord, the idea of his beloved, the one that he loves, going before him, but he can't entirely see him, but he knows he's there. And that's kind of the challenge to us. In the same way that you have chosen to be with your partner, and you love them greatly, even when things aren't great. We have the same attitude towards our relationship with God, towards our life of prayer, that we choose to be with him and to carry on, even though there's nothing that we feel as such. And I think it's very important to recognise that we are more than just our feelings. Certainly our feelings come into our prayer, and I think it's important to acknowledge our feelings, to acknowledge our anger, our sadness, our confusion. Quite often we're told to put those aside and say your prayers. But again, that's to put things into a box. Bring those into your prayer. Bring the confusion and say to the Lord, I'm confused, what's going on? Bring the anger, I'm angry at this, that and the other. Bring those feelings into your prayer and let them feed it. And the Lord will give you the light that you need. Sometimes we don't need light. Sometimes we need the darkness, because in the darkness things become more profound. We realise what the Lord really means to us. They say absence makes the heart grow fonder, and it's the same in prayer. Sometimes when we can't recognise the Lord, when we find it difficult, perhaps it's because there's a block on our part, or perhaps it's because it's an invitation to the Lord, from the Lord, for us to get to know him better, for us to experience a different part of the Lord. But the important thing is that we recognise that it's more about our commitment, but also our commitment to God, but also God's commitment to us. That we are never left alone, even if we may feel like it.
If everything was the same all the time, we would begin to coast. And my father says coasting's a bad thing when you're driving, not to do it, and I'm terrible at it. So the trials, the difficult times in our life of prayer, those, what some people call divine absences in life, actually sort of conversely strengthen us. Because, we as I say, if there was that moment of what we call consolation all the time, that moment where we feel God is close to us, if that happens all the time, there would be no growth in our life. There'd be no moments of growth, and then we'll recognise that there are things in our life which we need to seek to purify. The intentions in our hearts that we need to look at. And so the trials of life, just like in school, when a child finds maths really hard, that's when you know that he's learning. And it's the same with the difficult parts of our life of faith, of our life of prayer. The mistakes that we make show that we're learning, that we are on that journey, and that journey of faith is having an impact upon our life. So that difficult time, that darkness, isn't a bad experience. Like the difficult times in life that Elliot was talking about. So often in confession, I've told people, if you're angry with God, just be angry. Because people think, as Elliot sort of alluded to, people think, well, I've got to say my prayers now. Dear God, I love you and all this. But you don't, you hate him at the moment. So just say that. Because being able to say it, just like having an argument with your lover, releasing that is how you grow as a couple, isn't it? Being able to work through all of that.
How did you find the church and what called you towards it?
It's a really interesting question, and it's a question which I love to hear different people's stories. When they what brought you to church to be a religious person, but what brought me to here to be a priest in particular, because everybody's got such different journeys, and everybody who, whether they become a Christian or a Catholic, or whether they become a priest or get married, it's a calling. It's a calling from God, and how we respond to that calling is really interesting and completely varied. Some people expect, and some people receive that, big sort of finger pointing to you, talking, and all of that. But for other people, it's much more subtle. So significant in my life is my family. So whereas my parents at the time weren't particularly religious, they were brought up in a religious context. It was my grandparents really. Used to take me to mass on a Saturday evening up in the valleys, and that was the sort of the first interaction. And of course, when you're little, you used to go to mass, fall asleep, play cars up and down the benches and all of that. But then as you get older, and I made my first Holy Communion, I became an altar boy, and all of that. And then there's a sort of a closeness with what goes on during the mass, and it sort of builds up quietly. And as you get older, you get your prayer life develops as it does, because as we leave primary school, go to high school, and things change. Then you go through the turbulence of high school, of growing up, of finding your feet, finding out who you are. And even among all of that, my faith played a really important role in that, in different ways. And so even like when I was growing up, I was bullied a lot. But even through that, not only was my faith there to support, but also the church, the local community, through the teachers, who lots I'm still friends with, through some of my friends, the pupils in the school. And so then when I went to university, I went to London, I did theology, studied about God. And so it's sort of a gradual sort of realization of that's what God's wanted me to be. There was no sort of ta-da moment for me. And it was just one of those natural things. And as you think about it and reflect upon life, and you think, what's going to bring about in you that sort of greatest happiness, that greatest, interior moment in you that this is the right thing to do. So I'm sure lots of couples have it when they're preparing for marriage, maybe, or when you're thinking about a particular career path. When something's not quite right because of a little niggling doubt. And even my journey to being a priest, even though it's been quite tough and it's not an easy road and it's not easy being a priest, all of that is outweighed by the fact I know I'm in the right place, doing the right thing, and it's that making that generous response to the Lord and which comes from our life of prayer. And I'm sure that Elliot's journey will be quite different, to that. So.
Certainly, my own journey is quite different from that. I'm a convert, so I wasn't brought up as a Christian as such. And I suppose to cut a very very long story short, for me it was that search for truth, for something that made sense. And I wanted a certain level of security and certainty in what I was doing and in life, which I think we all want, really. And in kind of investigating the intellectual claims of Christianity, it came to be increasingly clear that this is where I wanted to be. This is what made sense on an intellectual level. And they say often that the longest journey is the 6 inches from the head to the heart, because we've been talking about prayer. We've been talking about this nature of relationship. With the Christian faith, there's always an intellectual element, and then there's the heart element. There's that kind of knowing about someone and knowing somebody. The French do it better. They've got 2 words for to know. You've got connaître, to know a person, and you've got savoir, to know a fact. And for me, it was very much kind of getting the head down to the heart, knowing about God to knowing God himself, and that was what led me into the church as such. And then what led me to kind of take this this road towards priesthood. Again, to cut another very long story very short, I think it was ultimately a response to love. So as Father Daniel was talking, we talk about vocation. Vocation comes from Latin vocare, which means to call. So all states of life, all vocations are God's call to us, to know him, to love him, and to serve him. But it's not a servile thing. We don't submit ourselves completely to God in a kind of Lord and Master kind of way, but in a friendship kind of way, in a fatherly kind of way. We do what our Father says because he has our best interests at heart, and he has that. He helps us to find out how we will best flourish as people, and ultimately I consider my own vocation a response to the love that God has shown me. Throughout my life I've been able to spot moments, call them God moments or whatever you want to call them, where kind of God breaks through in a very obvious way. We talk about kind of prayer being, sometimes it's more obvious, sometimes it's less obvious, sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. When I kind of look back, you can see where God has been active, and you can see those acts of love and how I've been blessed in such a way by God. And I think the very base of my vocation is to respond to that. I've been so blessed by God, I've been so loved by God, that I'd like to share a little bit of that love as much as I can in my own small way with other people, and to help other people experience that great love. So, if you want to summarise it in a word, love.
3, 2, 1. Action.
Do you feel you can compare other things to prayer?
At the basis, we've established, I think we've well established by now, that prayer is a relationship. It's a relationship with the living God. And we experience that relationship through various things. Again, going back to Ignatius Loyola and his foundation of the Jesuits, they talk about pray as you go, to rip off the well-known phrase. The idea that prayer doesn't have to be something formal. Prayer doesn't have to be on your knees. It can be those simple moments during the day when you kind of turn back, or those simple moments when you recognise Christ in somebody else. Again, St. Francis talks about kind of recognising Christ in the poor and the marginalised. The Dominican order talks about finding Christ in the intellect, so through study. And again, there's all these wonderful ways of discovering Christ. In the breviary and the set of prayers that priests pray through the day, at night prayer, there's the encouragement to make an examination of conscience. So that's kind of to evaluate the good and the bad. There's also a movement which encourages us to make an examination of consciousness. So those moments where God has been, trying to recognise where God has been in the less obvious ways. Because quite often God doesn't speak to us in booming clouds or thunder. Sometimes it'd be nice, but it doesn't quite work that way. And it's about having an open heart and an open ear to recognise God wherever He will find you. And it's always God who makes the first move. It often feels like we are coming to God, but it's always God that calls us into His presence. Whether that's in a church or whether that's through the sandwich you buy for the homeless person outside. And it's about kind of having the eyes, the ears, and the heart to recognise Christ in the other.
One of the high points of the life of a Catholic is the celebration of Mass, and it's from Mass where we get the source and our strength and the grace to be able to live out our vocations in the world. And one of the interesting parts of Mass, the celebration of Mass, is as Mass is celebrated, there's sort of 2 parts to the Mass. The first part is the liturgy of the Word, where we hear the scriptures read, where we hear God speaking to us, and then the priest talks about what that means, how that applies in our life. Then the second part then is we call the liturgy of the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, which Elliot mentioned earlier, the changing of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And so you experienced something of the benediction before, and at the end of a longer time of prayer. What's interesting about the celebration of Mass is that the high point of the Mass is the people's reception of Holy Communion, the people receiving the host, Christ Himself, consuming, right into the very heart, into the very guts of our life. It's quite an intimate moment for a Catholic. But then immediately after that moment, Mass seems to just stop and finish. No sooner as you've received, got to the high point of the Mass, then there's a sudden stop. There's no gradual sort of tailing away. And there's a reason for that, and that's because that the moment we receive communion, we have that intimate moment with the Lord, we're called to go out. So our time that we spend with the Lord doesn't cease. It continues. And Mass really begins. Encountering the Lord begins at the conclusion of the Mass. So that time we have spent, that time in Mass, has to have an impact in our life that we go out. And one of the last things the priest says is, go and announce the gospel of the Lord. And that's not necessarily by standing on the soapbox perhaps at the corner of Charles Street, but in the everyday ways that we live, in the ways we conduct ourselves, that we relate to others. We're able to offer that charity, not only financial charity, but that love that we show to our neighbours, and all of that is all a prayer, but in a very different way to perhaps how we've been thinking about it here over the last hour or so. So so it's Saint Teresa of Avila, I think, is this. God talks about finding God in the pots and the pans, in everything that we do. So yeah.
Do you feel others can benefit from prayer even if they aren't religious?
It's a really interesting question. In everything we said, we've talked about prayer. The preposition of prayer is that it's a relationship. It's the establishment of an intimacy with someone, a person who we say is God. And so in that respect, there has to be that faith element to it. There has to be some sort of faith element. There is an element where people sort of pray, but they're quite sure. They're sort of reaching out. There's a reaching out, a searching for something, for someone. But it's the part of the prayer is the listening for that response, and so it's that two-way which is essential. So making the distinction between our life of prayer, that the prayer we have, it presupposes that we have some sort of faith. There's some sort of faith background, and that's that religion, the religious element to it. There's distinguishing that then from anything else then is different. So the searching for the other, something more, making that space in your life. People speak of meditation and all that. There's something quite different. Making that space, and within that context, you don't need that religious element, because it's a step back. It's a different sort of type of thing to a prayer. It's something quite different. Prayer, especially in the Christian context, is something quite particular. It's something which presupposes a two-way correspondence, a two-way dynamic. So if that makes sense. So do you want to build on that?
I suppose that there are two aspects to what prayer is, really. If we're talking about kind of prayer within not a necessarily religious context, you've got kind of the act of prayer, so finding a time for you, finding a time of silence, of quiet, and the introspection, and the time of kind of sorting your thoughts and calming yourself down, things like that. So obviously that has physiological effects. It's better for your mental health, better for your also to an extent your physical health as well, because it lowers stress and things like that. So obviously there's that aspect of prayer as a physical act, but that's to impoverish prayer in the Christian understanding, because as Father has already said, prayer is something really quite particular and requires a relationship and requires a certain reciprocity. Within us all, again, I've mentioned this idea before, within us all there's a yearning for something. There's the God-shaped hole, as C.S. Lewis calls it, or if you want to use the terms of St. Augustine, he talks about it as the magis, the thing that is beyond us, that you can't quite put your finger on, but there's something out there. In fact, St. Augustine is actually a very good example of somebody who prayed without necessarily knowing who God was. St. Augustine, sort of fourth century, fifth century, North African saint. He starts off. In fact, he goes through everything else before he arrives at God. He goes through every cult you can possibly imagine before he arrives at God. With some very strange ideas. He goes through every philosophy, every cult, every grouping to try and fill that hole. He recognises that there is something beyond him, that there is something beyond what we experience.
That was a very eye-opening experience. When I usually think of Christian prayer, it's a very formal occasion. It's church hours before going to sleep. So for them to say that it doesn't matter when or where or what's happening, you can pray to God. It's a relief, dare I say. And I'm sure it's a big comfort having such a close feeling to one's God that you feel you can talk to them any time, any day. But I do need to be honest, settling into a Christian mindset has proved a little more difficult for me. It's very comfortable being able to pray wherever I want instead of pleading with an all-powerful ruler of the world. It just feels like I'm speaking to someone I look up to, and it's great. In fact, since that talk with the priests, this is going to sound mad, I've been talking to dead relatives, even people who've passed away, because as much as talking to God is a comfort, tell my nan some good news or reminiscing with my vampy, that's something different altogether, and that right there, even if praying to God isn't your cup of tea, it's something so indescribably blissful, and something that I'm not sure I could live without now. So there's some parts of it I struggle with, there's some parts of the religion which I struggle to believe in, but the raw emotional feeling I get from it, the the comfort I get from it, it's irreplaceable. So again, I get prayer and religion not being your cup of tea, but for me, it's even just the prayer side of it has helped. So I implore you to try it, even for a day.